Hello and welcome to the FinTech Finance Virtual Arena. Today we're going to be looking at the changing nature of payments in a post-PSD2 and especially a post-SCA landscape. And joining me today is Jukka Ylinen from Giesecke & Devrient. Jukka, how are you doing here today?
Thank you, Doc. I'm doing fine.
Amazing. So Jukka, for our audience who might not be aware, could you tell us a bit more about your role at Giesecke & Devrient, or G&D, and G&D itself actually?
Okay, so Giesecke & Devrient, we are kind of a very old fintech because we have reinvented ourselves over 100 and almost 70 years. So from the paper notes, which we still do, by the way, to the plastic, then to the chip cards, and then of course finally to the bits and pieces, so to the digital solutions. And my role here is that I'm heading a portfolio for digital solutions for financial institutions, both on the merchant acquiring side as well as the issuing side. And I'm located in Helsinki, Finland, and serving this great German company.
Amazing. So, Jukka, thank you so much for joining us here today. Now, to kick things off, when PSD2 came into full effect back in 2018, Strong Customer Authentication, or SCA, was then on the books. What were the biggest fears that the banks were expressing at the time?
I believe that the biggest fear they had was the question that, especially really for an issuing bank, which this impacted very much, was that can they comply with such requirements? And especially as user authentication, it has a really profound impact on many of the processes, of course, what the bank has, as well as the systems that they do have. To give an example, so when we log into the web bank or we log into the mobile banking, there is an authentication. Okay, not that would be now impacted by the PSD2, but if you have a process, if you have a system, if you have technologies, you need to then look, can you apply those also for the items which were impacted by the PSD2, which is, by the way, in a simple terms, e-commerce transactions and then the contactless transactions. So, and then of course you need to also look at what does it mean for you as a bank when you do payment in, or your consumer customers do payment in different environments. Whether you do online payments, do you mobile payments, you make payments on the point of sales, if you do the point of sales payment with your card, your wearable, your phones and so forth. So there is a huge amount of items that you need to think about because then the outcome should be that there is some sort of a unified way of doing this from the bank's point of view, but especially from the consumer point of view.
I completely agree, and that joint approach is going to be so important. It's now 2021, and what has changed within the industry, despite online retail becoming incredibly more prevalent across every demographic, have opinions changed due of the regulations?
Well, I guess that there is still probably a bit kind of I don't know, split opinions, but at least the variation how things have been implemented and if they have implemented, when are they being implemented. In Europe, where the PSD2 and the economic area that it impacts, most of the countries, they have had their, let's say, deadline already moved twice, but now, to my understanding, most of the countries, they are already fully compliant. How they are compliant, that's another story. Then, of course, if we look outside of the EU or the economic area of the Europe, so then, of course, PSD2 does not directly impact, but indirectly it does, and we can maybe cover that separately. E-commerce merchant, if you look, which is the big impact here too, I believe that they have implemented strong customer authentication, for example, using this 3DS 2.0 technology, which means in layman's term that when you buy online, you need to provide typically your payment card information as earlier, but additionally you could receive, as an example, requests to provide, for example, your PIN using your banking app, or it could be that the SMS is sent to you like a one-time password which you need to present, so that you are kind of authenticated, let's say, with the second factor, because the SCA, the strong customer authentication, basically means that there needs to be two of the components: something that you have, something you know, and then potentially third option, something you are, which could be biometrics.
Interesting, yeah, and I think that changing almost paradigm of what customers are going to have to be dealing with and become comfortable with is going to be really maybe some of the slow moving parts in this whole journey. Now, with that in mind, currently we're still not at that point every time, and some of the bank's customers aren't aware of this change yet. They're not even aware of open banking. I think it's fair to say, to be then saying that we now need 3-factor authentication is going to be huge. So for the bank's customers, what has changed for them already?
Yes, of course, in the countries where, and most of the EU countries, it's been implemented, so there is a one at least type of implementation, and typically it's issuer, let's say, dependent. So issuer A versus issuer B might have a different implementation even in one country. Of course, if they are somehow harmonized, that would be good, because many of us still use services from more than one issuing bank. If strong customer authentication is implemented as it is, like I said, in most countries and by most banks, then it really depends how your bank that issued your card implemented it, as said. And there are differences. It can be really very easy that you don't even need to too much communicate to your consumers that, look, now there is this kind of a secondary way of authenticating when you do, for example, e-commerce or contactless payment. Or it could be very complex, which means that then it's also very difficult to communicate to your customers. What does it mean? How do you use it? And there, of course, there are differences, for example, according to demographics, just like you said it. So one example is that if you use, for example, mobile as a means to provide this second authentication, for example, that you could use your mobile app, provide the PIN there, and then there you go, or even OTP. Well, younger generation, probably they are very savvy on this one. They have also the phones, but if you look at the elderly people, do they all have a mobile phone? Not necessarily. If they do have, well, do they understand what does it mean that now I need to, I receive this kind of a one-time PIN or let's say not necessarily PIN, but the ID that you need to then enter. I would be suspicious, even myself nowadays, that okay, well, what's coming to me and how to use. So there is a big, let's say, range of user experiences that has been implemented, and one maybe example here is that when looking at how well it's done, reviewing just, for example, the app ratings that you have in the Google Play or Apple's App Store, there are quite often comments on authentication experience. And often, actually, when you look at, there is a 1 or 2 star for the app, which is, of course, typically doing much more than just authentication. The authentication, and especially this strong customer authentication, is in the core of that one, because people have felt that, well, now it got really complex, and they express actually their bad experience by providing then these low ratings for the app, although the app itself could be actually great.
I mean, that's really interesting, isn't it? And I think that underlines how important payments has become to people now. You know, people realize it is actually almost, as much as people just want to pay, if it doesn't go right, then that is suddenly a problem. If it goes right, they don't even know they've almost made a payment, and that's almost like the thankless nature of the industry. Now, it's interesting that if you think consumers have now got that customer demand from their payments, the merchants have always had that. I mean, especially small, medium enterprises, they've always had cash flow problems typically, and to be able to just get paid is so important. Without much time being spent on wondering whether SCA has to be an apocalypse event, is there any market share for effectively the bank that can actually provide that solution to a merchant? I mean, if it's already impinging on Google Play reviews, surely the bank that can just say, hey, look, we've got the system, the program that can solve all that when SCA comes in, is going to be the market share leader, surely.
Yeah, like you said it, for the merchant, this has a huge impact. So it is a fundamental, of course, because they are there selling their goods, and one important part is that they get paid on those goods. And now this SCA basically applies a secondary layer on the security, which is kind of it's a good for merchant, because then there is a really authenticated user, which issue has said that, okay, it's the right user. So then, of course, the payment transaction is kind of a guaranteed. But same time, this has then, let's say, one layer also on the user experience that you may need to do as a consumer a little bit more. And in the worst case, of course, failure in payment means a lost transaction. It means, of course, that particular sales is lost. But in the worst case, if that's a clumsy experience, I might, as a user, see that, well, I don't want to buy actually on this e-commerce site or merchant anymore because it was not a good user experience. Maybe I do and select another one because there is a choice to be made, especially nowadays. So and if you look at on the other side, we all as a consumers, we are really, I would say, almost pampered with the great user experiences, because there is a lot of course, the big fintechs and the Apples and Googles who provide really great services. They have really thought the whole journey there. But same time, there are fintechs who have looked on certain niche services and provided really typically their point or angle where they come is the user experience. So sure. Therefore the bar is really high, and then merchant needs to also let's say acknowledge that one as well as of course the issues too.
Yeah. Now with that in mind, there are a few different concepts of what strong customer authentication is, especially around the world. But how can a bank card remain at the heart of payments going forward with SCA?
There is, like we a little bit touched already, different ways of doing the SCA. There is still a lot of these OTPs, which is basically that you get an SMS, typically, could be a push notification as well, and then you take that code and you enter, and there you go. Not very secure because it's been also breached. You have dongles, or actually this kind of a calculators, which are separate tokens, which enables to provide again this kind of a one-time codes. Mobile, as we said, and the apps that are using. So there is a range of technologies to do that one. Of course, then the challenge comes that, okay, who manages all that one? Like mobile, that's where most of the banks have their channel, but at the same time, everybody does not necessarily have that one. Dongles, it's an additional cost and so forth. But the one good thing that the banks typically have is that, well, they issue cards. They issue payment cards, credit cards, debit cards, and actually, because these are today contactless cards, these can be used also for the SCA. And these have also the great thing because it has this I have factor. So it is something that you possess, and you can control. So that's an additional second form factor. And the good thing on that one is also that they are those devices, really contactless card, they have a smart card component, which is a tamper-proof device, which, for example, mobile by default is not, or OTP is not. So there is a lot of benefits that the bank already have, and as said, so now they can use this one also for the SCA, which comes then to, for example, in our case, to Convigo Tap.
Definitely, and that leads perfectly, and as you said, so I mean, with that in mind, I've done a bit of research as well, but for our audience, can you tell me a bit more about Convigo Tap and the technology behind the solution, and how that can still comply with even the most strictest of SCA concepts?
Right. Yes, Convigo Tap is our brand name for the solution where you can use your existing, already issued payment card for the strong customer authentication. And basically what it means is that the cards are there, so you don't need to do anything. That's great. What you need to have in the mobile, you need to have a capabilities basically to interact with this card. So there we provide an SDK, so small piece of software which can be embedded, for example, to the banking app or banking wallet. And by doing this, you can basically use the payment card, read information out of that one. There is a technology behind which is secure, and I don't go to details on that one, but this enables that you can read that, okay, this is a payment card, and now I can use this as a second form factor because I believe that now it is Jukka because Jukka possessed that card. This works with any device which has a NFC enabled, so Android, and now lately we have implemented also support for iOS, which means that you basically have the whole mobile or all type of devices supported, and also the card side. So as said, so any card can be, so as long as it's a contactless card, which nowadays most of the cards are, whether they are MasterCard, Visa, Amex, or any other payment network labeled cards. So you don't need to invest. They are already there. And then additional feature there is that because you need to, of course, still authenticate somewhere in the backend. You can implement this by yourself, but also if you want to use this for so-called FIDO authentication, which is a standard for the authentication, this payment card now works as an authenticator, FIDO authenticator. So if you have a FIDO compliant, for example, backend, you have maybe some other FIDO authenticators, which could be again this kind of a dongles and so forth. So now your payment card also works as a FIDO authenticator. So there is a lot of, let's say, elements that you already have as an issue, no investment, and therefore it's, let's say, quick to market. Maybe one more aspect on this one is also that when people have, this experience on tapping when they do payment, now it is the same behavior. You just tap and you do the authentication, which is, by the way, the big thing, because how we behave, there needs to be some learning curve, and now there is, because we are already used to this payment use case.
Yeah, and it keeps coming back to that customer kind of behavioral aspect of payments, or at least cultural aspect around payments. And it's interesting to see how those have diverged as card technology or mobile technology, or at least digital payments, have vastly changed. And it's exciting that you guys over at G&D are really working on kind of harmonizing that. Now, one part of disharmony that we have touched on slightly in this conversation is looking at the industry as a whole across the world. And obviously the fact that Europe has now adopted SCA, but parts of for instance, the UK hasn't and APAC haven't, but some are, obviously the UK will adopt it, but APAC is looking at it and saying, how are we going to interact with European sellers? So how do you think certain nations are, in particular in APAC, are looking at SCA, and do you think they are also going to adopt something similar?
I believe very strongly they do. As you said, so EU, there is the let's say regulatory enforcement for this one, so you needed to do it. We have been struggling, to be honest, a bit on that one, for the reasons that we discussed earlier. But now, as it is pretty much there already, so and I have understood, for example, also UK, it's going to be applied. Well, it's already kind of being applied, but the end date or the full enforcement should be also next year. So, which is similar to Switzerland. So, this means that if I would be, for example, the e-commerce merchant, let's say in Australia or Singapore, and I would like to actually offer my services, of course, for the entire world. And if there is a European customer who wants to buy from me, well, they can do it. There is no enforcement that that merchant should be somehow regulated by PSD2 because it's for, of course, the Europe. But that also means that if my issuer, which is most likely European issuing bank, doesn't actually allow, there is no exemption rules applied and so forth, so they can reject the payment. So if I would like to make that purchase, but my bank thinks that, okay, well, it's a high risk, they can actually reject the payment, which means that then it's a lost business for those merchants. So especially in the e-commerce space, I think that this almost kind of let's say pushes you as a merchant to look the ways to apply such strong customer authentication. And one of the things that we see being almost every country or nation being rolled out is, for example, this 3DS, where you have then already this secondary layer of security. Not everywhere, but I see that wherever we discuss, for example, because we also offer the 3DS offering together with our G&D partner company, etc. All customers are very much either already onto it or just thinking how to do it, and not that whether they do it.
And now, banks are known almost for their lethargy when it comes to implementing such wide-changing payments, almost I want to say strategies, but ultimately it comes down to the regulation. So we're going to see in some districts that's actually going to have to be adopted. Now, I know you've already brought up some of the benefits for the merchants for being early adopters, to bank with an acquiring bank that already looks at that. But if we look to the banks, what are the benefits for them for being early adopters for this technology?
I guess that whether you are early or later adopter, so it would be always that you have cost efficiency for this kind of a technology or solution, because the investment really is very low, or almost nothing, because you have much of that infrastructure already provided by yourself as an issuer. It's also a quick deployment, because again, things are there, people have this behavior, they know how to basically use this, the habit of tapping, and then of course you have always this good user experience. And I believe that the big, let's say, early adopter impact comes especially from the user experience. Thinking about that you would need to, for example, open your mobile banking app and then use that one for the secondary authentication, or getting the code and entering that one somewhere. That's not so, at least a super neat way of doing the authentication. But if you just, when you need to do that, you just tap your card and there you go. I mean, it is a very good user experience, and having that kind of a let's say leader position and the image as a bank, I believe that would provide you a good start if you are the one of the first, for example, bringing this to any markets.
That's absolutely incredible, and what we've seen to be, hammering home from this conversation is it seems to be benefiting the merchants, by reducing chargebacks or failed transactions, and also the customer experience. I mean, is it really just as simple as that? And suddenly, instead of having to go through texts or reams of different kind of authentication methods, you think this will be the best way for customer experience to go forward? I certainly think so. Is that correct?
Well, I of course strongly believe on that one, because maybe if you just take the comparison, try to make payment with the contact card, which means that you need to chip and pin, you need to enter to the slot, enter your pin, and even if you don't enter your pin, just to do that one, versus that you have a contactless that you just tap and go. I mean, it's an easy choice, and it's the same here, I would say.
Definitely. I completely agree. And Jukka, I just want to say a massive thank you for appearing on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much, and especially when it comes to commerce, anything like that is just so interesting to hear how payments are going to change dramatically soon. And it's brilliant that we've got Giesecke and Devrient working on that. So thank you very much. And also to our viewers, thank you so much for watching. You can catch the rest of the series and much more over at www.ffnews.com, and of course YouTube and LinkedIn, where I'll see you in the comments.